Well, good afternoon. You know, you can observe a lot just by watching. It's true. I'm a great fan of Yogi Berra and the wonderful way that man absolutely had a way of destroying the English language. And he once was reported to have been chastising one of his young players by saying, you know, son, you can observe a lot just by watching. So that's one of my favorite quotes from Yogi. In the next 6 minutes, I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of my passions. And particularly, I think it's a good example of how sometimes, yet still in the world, we can find something big to do that's both also simple and elegant by practicing our Yogi Berraism. So in our case, who did we observe by watching? Well, it turns out it was Mother Nature. But I get ahead of myself. We all know that TED is about solving big issues and big problems. And I'm what I call myself a recovering engineer. So I'm not going to tackle the real big ones, but I'm going to pose the question here to us this afternoon in a slightly different way. What are the world's biggest problems that might have a technological solution? And so things come to mind like renewable energy, curing cancer, providing clean water to the world's population. That's it, right there. Even I, a recovering engineer, can get passionate about that one because it seems like it should have a technological solution, especially when we read that the World Health Organization tells us that 3.5 million children die every year in this world, not from lack of water, but from lack of clean water. Why should this be so? Well, it turns out that the world does have a water problem, but the question is why. It turns out actually that if you look at it from a global perspective, that there's over 52 billion gallons of water on this earth for each of us, 7 billion people. And we all know, though, that the problem, of course, is because most of that water is in the world's oceans and is salty and non-drinkable. And so to illustrate that graphically, if you look at all the world's water represented by the glasses on this slide, all 7 billion of us, believe it or not, are just surviving on that one last glass of water in the lower right corner. But that's really not the problem yet, because it also turns out that over 85% of us 7 billion people live a few miles from the world's oceans. So what again is really the problem? Especially what's the problem that's so big that we allow 3.5 million children, not mentioning the adults in this world, who die from lack of clean water? Well, like with most things in the world, it's really a problem with economics. Man has about 10 different ways to desalinate water, and they're all too expensive. So this talk is really about asking ourselves the central question of why is it too expensive to desalinate water, and can we even do better than what we currently do? And it turns out, if you strip away, look at it from an engineering perspective, all these 10 different ways that the world desalinates water all have one thing in common, and that's the use of physical pressure. And I purport here to you that that physical pressure is the problem why we innately have desal that costs too much. And it really boils down to what economists call capital costs and operating costs. They're both too high because we're using pressure. In the case of capital costs, it's too high. Why? Because if we use pressure, well, we need a pressure vessel. And the only thing that holds that pressure vessel together is metal. Now let's stop there. What's the dumbest thing to put next to that metal? Salty, corrosive, brackish water. And so the capital costs are very high. It's not any better on the operating side either, because to have pressure, we need a pressure pump. And that pressure pump can only be driven by big electricity. And something called the second law of thermodynamics tells us that electricity is by far the most expensive form of energy man has. So we've got high cost problems. Now let's juxtapose that. Let's do our yogiism and see what we can observe just by watching. In this case, Mother Nature. Well, it turns out, we don't think about it much, but Mother Nature has been desalinating water perfectly for 4.5 billion years. And she does it in a simple, elegant Texas two-step. She simply evaporates water off the world's oceans and condenses it back as rain. And so if you think about it, when she uses low-grade heat, engineering term, from solar power to evaporate that water off the surface of the ocean, heck, that's the act of desalination right there, because all the salt stays behind. And we simply form these beautiful cumulus clouds out of the water vapor that comes off the oceans. The lesser of the two steps is just as important but not as well understood, and that is that cold air can't hold as much moisture as hot air. And so when those clouds have to get over the Sandia Mountains here in Albuquerque, they get colder, and the air literally says, I can't hold this water anymore, and so it rains. And you get back 100% of the energy that it took to evaporate that water. So in summary, I'm kind of suggesting that the whole problem with the economics of desal, a big problem in the world, it's kind of like summed up by no pressure, man. Could we just figure out a way to desal water without using pressure? And it turns out we started a company 6 years ago here at Albuquerque to do just that. And it turns out we use the same plastic, inexpensive plastic that you see on your street corners, political signs, and real estate signs to make these plastic towers like you see in the lower right picture. And we fundamentally have observed Mother Nature, watched her greatly, and said we can actually, believe it or not, even though we were told we couldn't, for hundreds of years of chemical engineers said it was not possible to simply get the energy back to reduce the cost by simply evaporating water from anything, dirty, brackish, cruddy water on the outside of these sheets, into the air, just like Mother Nature, divert that air back down into all these thousands of flutes where it condenses out. We actually have improved on nature. We get about 3 gallons of water for 1 gallon that she gets. But the fundamental point is I want to leave you with is hopefully you share our passion here in Albuquerque for the company that was started to think differently about how to desalinate water. And even beyond that, even beyond our passion for that subject, hopefully it's an example to each of you in the audience to pursue your passions. And ideally you can find a way to help solve a big problem still in the earth. And ideally do it simply and with elegance, and do it as Yogi suggested. Observe, figure out what we can do just by watching. And in our case, we did it watching nature. Thank you for your attention.